So today we're going to talk about countries that are fighting over water as part of my Actually What's Happening series, where we try to get away from breaking news a little bit and focus on really big topics. And I got really interested in this when I took a rafting trip down the Colorado River a few years ago with a queer rafting group. Highly recommend. So the UN and UNICEF together have put out 2 reports in the last couple of years that help show the scope of the problem. UNICEF put out a report first that said that about 4 billion people live with water scarcity about 1 month a year. So that's almost half the world's population. They basically said in 2025, more than half the population of the world will live in a water scarce place. And they define water scarcity as not enough water for people or economics basically in a place. And they also say that 700 million people may be displaced by just water issues. And this is all connected to other things, right? A couple days ago, we talked about energy and talked about hydroelectricity, which we'll really dig into a little bit later. And in a couple weeks, we'll talk about migration patterns, which I think are also important to talk about. But importantly, the UN then put out a kind of companion report in March of 2024 last year that basically also said that water conflict is on the rise. And India and Pakistan is a great illustration of how this is playing out. So there was that conflict last month in India and Pakistan, which you may have heard about. And before that, just before that, in April of this year, there was a treaty that is set between India and Pakistan where there is a major river that originates in India and then it flows into Pakistan. And most of Pakistan's water for irrigation and drinking and stuff comes from that river. And so they have a really long-standing agreement since the 1960s to basically say India is going to continue to supply that water and peace is important and we don't want people to die of not having enough water. Right? But in April, that treaty sort of expired, but that happens sometimes. And so they were looking at ways to kind of continue the treaty moving. But then when the conflict started in May, Modi started saying things like water and blood can't flow together, which is a little scary. And then Reuters reported that Islamabad said after India suspended the treaty in April, that it considered any attempt to stop or divert the water to be an act of war, which is not great. And they say the context, which is basically, 80% of Pakistani farms depend on the Indus River system, as does a lot of the hydropower. So that was in May, and that was a report from Reuters. This is Al Jazeera, though, just a couple days ago this week, where India says it will never restore the Indus water treaty system to Pakistan. And Amit Shah, who's a really powerful minister in India, said, we will take the water that was flowing to Pakistan from Rajasthan by constructing a canal, and Pakistan will be starved of water it's been getting unjustifiably. And crucially, I was looking into this, and it doesn't look like India can just turn off the water with a switch right now. They've been putting together some major infrastructure projects over the last few years across the whole country, but particularly around there with dams and stuff and canals. And so there are some additional sort of construction projects that they're putting in motion that will allow them to slowly start to turn off the water to Pakistan. And that is going to be tough human rights wise, I think. So although there's a ceasefire still there with that conflict, it's a little worrying, obviously, with these issues, right? And these are 2 nuclear armed nations. So it's important to keep an eye on that. And we have a conflict segment that's going to come up in about a week. And so, follow along if you want to see more about that kind of stuff that's happening. But it's not just there. It's not just California. It's also happening on the continent of Africa, right? And so Ethiopia also has a controversial dam that they have been building for many years. And for this one, I thought it would be helpful to have a little bit of a map. So the Ethiopian dam is going here. This is from just Wikipedia, but it's a good map. And so they're putting a hydroelectric dam here in order to provide power for the country. Ethiopia needs regular power. And in our renewable energy segment, we talked about how hydroelectric power actually is more consistent than some other energy sources. And so it's a great way to have renewable energy. But what ends up happening from that is that the actual water potentially could get throttled as it goes up to the Nile River all the way up to Cairo, right? And as you may remember, the Nile flows that way, right? And so it's not all the river. The source of the Nile, most people say, is in Uganda at Lake Victoria down here. And so it's not stopping. It's on the Blue Nile, not the White Nile, I think is what that one's called. But that's also causing diplomatic tension in the region. So Egypt rejected a visit to the dam in February at a Nile Basin there's an organization of countries that are on the Nile River Basin. They get together and talk about trade and water supplies and stuff like that. And Egypt decided not to go this year, even though they're a crucial player in that because of the dam, because they rejected. And, I think it's another example of how these kinds of issues are creating potential geopolitical tension. And you can actually see the impact of how this could pan out, not in a warfare sense, but in a we don't have enough water sense in Iraq. So Iraq is getting hit by a few rivers that are flowing through Turkey and Iran that have been dammed. And so Iraq is having a hard time getting enough water for their farmers. And so in the case of a drought, which is happening this year for Iraq, you can see that the water supply is significantly shifting the land. And so Turkey and Iran have built these dams to protect their populations because droughts are becoming more common due to climate change. And that is great for Turkey and Iran, but it is having a bad impact on Iraq. And so how does that impact all of their relationships and also the people that are living there, right? And it's like, it's not just happening across borders, like country borders. Obviously here in the US, it's a big problem. And there are 7 states that are like in a big fight right now. And the Trump administration also has been weighing in a way that I think is very unhealthy. And it's a mess. And of course, it's 7 states plus Mexico with the Colorado River. So there is also that border dispute that's always happening. But in Germany, the Danube and the Rhine have been like super low this year, to the point where river cruise, not just like Viking river cruises, but also like shipping cruises have had to be canceled because it's like so low. In Mexico City, the Cutzamala Dam has been at like 28% of its normal capacity. France had one of its biggest droughts in history, and so they're having like big domestic water fights as well. And I think what is also important to keep in mind is that some of these water treaties can help maintain peace. So like in India and Pakistan, the treaty that has been keeping that river in place flowing to Pakistan in some ways has helped strengthen the relationship between the countries, right? And the same thing happened actually after the Bosnian War. So I was really interested to see a month ago that the like NATO leaders were meeting in Dayton, Ohio, and I grew up in the Midwest and was like shocked that all these world leaders were going to Dayton, Ohio, if you know, you know. But also it is a major space for peace. And one of the main reasons that the Bosnian War was able to be ended through a long-lasting treaty is because there was a major water treaty that was signed between a bunch of countries in that region to say like, we're going to share this water and it's good for all of us, to make sure that we all agree on what the terms of that are going to look like. Anyway, that's that on clean water. Next month, I think I'm going to talk about the aquifers. The New York Times did a crazy article about the US's like groundwater systems and how we're not tracking that very well, and maybe they're drying up. We don't actually know, and I want to look at that from a global perspective. But I'm interested in hearing what other people are seeing about clean water, and especially how it's like leading to conflict and also peace around the world. So let me know if you know about other like kind of leads. And of course, next month when we look at this, we will also look at the headlines from the previous month and put it into context. Thanks for following along. If you're watching all these videos, thank you so much. Please comment and follow. It's just helping me just like wrap my head around all the news. And so like, I hope it's helpful for you too.